Well, hello to everyone, especially in our good friends in Bangladesh. Thank you so much for joining us today at Teams Nation. We've had some great sessions so far, and this is the last one in our inaugural Bangladesh Teams Nation event. So my name is Peter Rising. I'm a Microsoft MVP in Office Apps and Services, and today I'm going to be talking to you about data loss prevention and retention within Microsoft Teams, but also in the wider context of Microsoft 365. So this is a compliance-based talk, a subject very, very important in both Teams and Microsoft 365. So a little bit about me to start with. I already told you my name, Peter Rising. I work at a company called Softcat as a technical consultant in public cloud. You can reach me in all sorts of ways. I'm not hard to find. You can find me on Twitter at M365Rising, LinkedIn. I spend a lot of time on the Microsoft tech community trying to help out our good community friends and members. I'm also the author of Microsoft 365 Security Administration MS500 Exam Guide and the co-author of the very, very newly released Managing Microsoft Teams MS700 Exam Guide, which has an absolutely brilliant foreword from Mr. Horde, who just spoke there previously. So, without any further ado, let's get into our first of our two topics in this compliance discussion. So what is data loss prevention? So data loss prevention, or DLP, is a set of tools and processes to ensure that sensitive data is not lost, misused, or accessed by unauthorized parties. So how does data loss prevention work within Microsoft 365? So basically, DLP allows you to configure policies which identify sensitive information across Microsoft 365 locations using what are called the built-in sensitive information types. We'll come to those in a moment. The locations that DLP can check include Exchange Online for your emails within Microsoft 365, SharePoint Online content, OneDrive content, and importantly, in this context, Microsoft Teams. So DLP helps to prevent accidental sharing of sensitive information such as credit card numbers or private medical information. DLP is also a very powerful tool to help educate your users with what are called policy tips, which will pop up in a very visual way in their Microsoft 365 applications, in Outlook, in Word, Excel, without restricting their ability to work. It's going to give them guides on how to work safely and not accidentally put sensitive information out there into the world. DLP can also report and alert when Microsoft 365 content contains a policy match. So DLP policies are made up, basically they consist of conditions, what you are looking for, and actions, so what happens when those conditions are met. So very, very simple how they work, but also very powerful. So I talked a bit about sensitive information types. So what are they exactly? Well, Microsoft 365 contains a vast number of these, in fact, of built-in sensitive information types, which can be found in the Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance Center at the moment. They are not currently, at least still not to my knowledge, I haven't checked in a while, not currently visible in the Compliance Center itself. You have to go to the Combined Security and Compliance Center to view these still, as far as I'm aware, which you can get to at protection.office.com and under classification and sensitive info types. And you can see in the screenshot there the first three that are listed in that built-in list. So you get things like, well, that top one in this example here is a customized one that I added in. So that's an example of the fact that you can build in your own custom sensitive information types if you have the need. It's, in my experience, very rare that you need to do that, but some organizations may come across that requirement. But there are literally an enormous number of the built-in ones that probably are going to suit your needs for region and sector. So the built-in types include regulatory compliance principles, which relate to financial, medical, and health and privacy information from a number of countries and regions throughout the world. And as I already mentioned in the previous slide, it's possible to define your own custom sensitive information types if required. And these custom sensitive information types may be created as keywords or regular expressions or dictionary large keywords. Excuse me. So how do we use data loss prevention within Microsoft Teams? Well, Teams obviously is the product of the moment, a 4-year-old product, near enough, I believe, and it's hard to believe it's only that old. But even in the world pre-COVID-19, it was already Microsoft's fastest adopted product in their history, and the pandemic times that we're living in now has only accelerated that. So this is why features like data loss prevention and retention, which we'll get to later, compliance is absolutely crucial when you are using Microsoft Teams in your organization. So how do we use DLP within Teams? So DLP protects sensitive information within Teams chat or channel messages, including private channel messages. It's important to point out, and I did verify this before this talk, that it's still the case that an E5 license is required to use DLP in conjunction with Microsoft Teams. That seems a little strange to me. I don't know why that would be the case when so many other things are not burdened by that need to go all the way up to E5, but at the moment, that is still the way Microsoft is licensing DLP for Teams. So I've got a very simple example on this screenshot here on this slide, and this is where a DLP policy was set to detect credit card numbers. So we can see that we've got a rule here which we can edit or we can delete it, and when we get into demo mode, we'll have a little bit more of a drive around some of these and show you what they look like. But here we can see that these DLP policies are made up of conditions and rules. So the conditions in this case are detect content that's shared only with people outside of my organization. The sensitive information type that we want to look for in this DLP rule is a credit card number. So if anyone types in a credit card number into a Teams chat, we want to detect that and take some actions on that. The actions that we want to take are we want to restrict access to the content, we want to notify the users with email and policy tips, and we want to send incident reports to an administrator. So DLP has some very, very powerful reporting and alerting built into it, which ensures that nothing like this gets missed. When you have your policy set up, you're going to get alerts, you're going to get emails. There's all sorts of ways to keep track of what is happening. So still on the same lines here, what happens when this is triggered? So in the policy that I had on the example in the previous slide, we had a credit card sensitive information type defined. So this has now been triggered in this screenshot, and an email has been sent to me as one of the administrators who has been targeted for to be alerted. So a rule has been detected, an email is generated, a low volume of content has been detected in Microsoft Teams, and we can see that we've got a match where it contains the sensitive information, and we can see there that the credit card number is showed there in the body of the text of the email. So you get a lot of information here in this email to show you exactly what has happened and why. So you will get some confidence levels here as well, and number counts. I'll come on to low volume and high volume of content as we get into the demo as well, because that's important to point out. So what does this look like within the actual Microsoft Teams application itself? So in this screenshot here, we have one of our users, James Smith, has tried to put a credit card number into his Teams chat. And the result of this is that it is immediately being blocked with this very visual message here with the red circle there. Isn't able to be processed, and if James wants to get more information on this, he can click on learn more and find out exactly why this is the case. So and get further information and education on why this has happened. So it's a very, very visual prompt there, as you can see. So DLP also protects sensitive information in the documents which are stored within Microsoft Teams, but it's important to be aware that we will need a SharePoint-enabled DLP policy for this as shown here in order for this to work. So this is true of many of the compliance features within Microsoft 365 that relate to Teams specifically, that Teams leverages many other workloads within Microsoft 365. The Teams chat and channel messages, for example, are very relevant to retention, so I'll not get into that just now. I'll get into that in the retention part of this presentation. But for the documents stored in Teams, there is a SharePoint site for those whenever you have a team, obviously, so that's an important consideration. So let's go into our first demo. So I will just switch out and into my browser, and we are going to look at data loss prevention in the Compliance Center in Microsoft 365. So you can reach this by going to https://compliance.microsoft.com. You can still get to data loss prevention from the Combined Security and Compliance Center, which you can reach from protection.office.com. Microsoft is strongly guiding you, encouraging you to use the more feature-rich and separate centers for security and compliance now. So we're going to work from the Compliance Center for the purposes of this demonstration. So specifically, we'll take a look at policies here. So I'll actually step it back a little bit just to give people awareness of how to get to here within the Compliance Center. I had this ready, but I'll go back home to show you what it looks like when you get into the Compliance Center. And if you want to find DLP, you just need to scroll down to the Solutions Catalog section. And here we go. We've got data loss prevention available here. We can click on View. If this is something we're going to be going into a lot, we can pin that and show it in the navigation permanently. So we can see that more prominently, and there it is. So we can open the solution from here, or we can open it from our solutions, and this takes us back into the data loss prevention section. We're going to focus in the context of this talk on policies. We're not going to discuss alerts, which is a preview feature just at the moment, or endpoint DLP settings, because that is a whole topic of its own. Maybe it's for a future talk. We'll concentrate on the basic policies and specifically relating to Teams. So we've got some example policies in here already, and we can see some differences already in how these are applied. We have two policies, one for GDPR, one for US financial data. These are enabled and in full operation. And we have an order of priority as well. So the top priority one, or the lowest priority one, I should say, the one that will be triggered first, and then it works down the list if you are bound by multiple DLP policies, is this GDPR one. So this one here, this UK Access to Medical Reports Act, you can see that this has a slightly different status, and this is set to test without notifications. So I'll show you, we'll go into one of these and have a quick sort of drive around, and then we'll set up a new one and show you how that looks as well. But if we pick on this UK Access to Medical Reports first, to give you a flavor of how a DLP policy works, we can get some quick statuses as to what it's going to do. So this is going to test without notifications. This is going to help detect the presence of information subject to United Kingdom, in this case, access to medical reports, including data like National Health Service numbers. It's going to apply to multiple Microsoft 365 workloads, including Exchange email, SharePoint sites, OneDrive accounts, and importantly here, Teams chat and channel messages. And it has two sets of policy settings, low volume of content and high volume of content, to access the medical reports. So that's a quick sort of look at what that's going to be doing. If we want to edit this policy, we can do so from the top bar here by clicking on the pencil. And hopefully that should come up in a moment. Yes, here we go. So we can't edit the name of the policy once it's set up. That is set in stone. That's not something that you're able to do. You can change the description if you wish to. So here we can see how it looks in terms of the locations to which DLP policies are applied. And we can see here we've pretty much got everything ticked here in terms of Microsoft 365 workloads. We've got Exchange email all the way down to on-premises repositories. There's all sorts of, this is ever growing and no doubt will continue to develop and change. as Chris alluded to in his talk, when you're looking at these Microsoft 365 features at any given time, you can rely on them for about 4 to 6 weeks. So always keep an eye on things like the Microsoft 365 roadmap, but look for these to change, and don't be surprised when they do. So I'll just put this bar to one side so we can get a clearer look at this. Focusing on Teams, what we can do, and this is true of all of these workloads, we can toggle these on easily if we want to. So if I don't want to do Exchange email, easy enough to do. If I want to get a bit more granular in terms of what I'm going to apply this DLP policy to within Teams chat and channel messages, I can go down and be specific in relation to accounts. So I may not want to do it for all teams within the environment. I may want to select specific teams here, so I can go on and be a bit more choosy in terms of the ones. So there we go. Now I've selected 3 teams and I have 3 accounts there. I can also explicitly exclude accounts if I want to. That option's now grayed out to me because I've gone the other way. I've explicitly included specific teams, but you can do it the other way if you wish to. So we've got our selections to apply to our policy here. We're editing this one in this case. Here we come to the low volume and high content, low volume and high volume of content detected within our DLP policy. So what this means is, it's easier to show you than to explain it really. So if we expand the low volume of content detected and then we edit this, we can get a more advanced view of what these low and high volumes are doing. So did I click on that or not? No, obviously I did not. So here we go. This is our rule for low volume of content within our DLP policy, which is going to apply to now 3 teams that we've specifically selected in our policy when we come to save it. So here's where the low volume and high volume and accuracy counts come into play. What is going to happen in this DLP policy starts with the conditions here. We will apply this policy to content that matches these conditions. We're going to be looking for sensitive information types, in this case relating to UK National Health Service numbers. We've got an accuracy level set here, which gets set by default of between 85 and 100 and 75 to 100 in this case. But this is where the low volume comes into play. It will match, there will be a policy match if there are between 1 to 9 instances of this occurring. So we can have different actions for low volumes of detections and high volumes of detections. And in this case, what another condition we're putting into play here is it'll detect when content is sent from the selections we've chosen with people outside of my organization. There are only 2 choices there, outside or inside, and we can choose which we want. We can add in some exceptions here if we want to, so we can put in except content is shared from Microsoft 365. We can put in additional actions to restrict access or encrypt. If we want to get very aggressive with this, we can restrict access or encrypt the content within Microsoft 365 locations, restrict third-party apps, audit or restrict activities on Windows devices. Lots of very, very strong controls we can put into play there. Now, that will come into play in terms of the choices we make in terms of enabling our policies, because you have to be very, very careful what you put in place. And that is why we have things like that test with notifications, which we'll come to in a moment. Speaking of notifications, what notifications do you want to be in place when there is a policy match from this rule? So user notifications to inform your users and help educate them on the proper use of sensitive info. That is set to on. Email notifications, a couple of choices here. You can notify the user who sent, shared, or last modified the content. You can notify specific people, make choices there, and you can add and remove specific people as well. If you want customized content in the email text or the email subject, you can put that in by ticking these boxes here and customize your text. And you can also enable user overrides, which are very, very useful if you want to give that level of trust back to the users who this will apply to, who may get this. If you don't want to get too aggressive, you can give them a prompt with the policy tip that you're sharing something that is potentially sensitive. Do you really want to do this? If they're certain they want to, if they've got a genuine business reason to do so, they can put in a justification to override it, and you can require a justification for that. Additionally, you can set this setting here to override the rule automatically if they report it as a false positive, and you can choose the severity that you want to have assigned to this rule if there is a match between low, medium, and high. Alerts here as well in terms of admin actions. So send an alert to admins when a rule match occurs. You can select that to on or off. You have to be very, very careful here when you're selecting these sort of things in terms of what you choose to include. Specifically this one, for example, the content that matched the rule, including the surrounding text and attachments and that sort of thing. I actually had a customer who had DLP in place, and they got very, very upset when the compliance administrator was actually able to go in and see the attachment of something that a CEO had shared. It was actually the CEO's banking information, and even as the compliance administrator, and this will differ from organization to organization, obviously, in terms of what is acceptable and what isn't, but that person should not have been seeing that content, so they needed to make a tweak to that particular setting in terms of what was included for the compliance administrator in terms of the notifications. Some additional options here at the bottom here. If there's a match for this rule, you can choose to stop processing any additional DLP policies and rules that may apply to workloads in those DLP policies, and you can change the priority for that particular rule as well. So we've not made any changes here, so we'll just go ahead and cancel that. So that is low volume. High volume, very, very similar principle, very, very similar look and feel. The main differences being the instance count. We're going to get instance counts of, if there's 10 or more instances which generate a match, then we've got some more aggressive settings in this policy to kick into play. And here you can see in this case, actually, the restrict access or encrypt the content is being activated, and we've got block people outside of the organizations. So lots of choices there that you can put into place to protect yourself when there's a higher volume of matches to your DLP policy. As you're going through these, they're fairly instinctive and intuitive, but you get these very, very handy tips along the way. These little eyes in the circle here, they do contain quite a lot of useful information at times, so don't disregard those. If you're concerned about anything, take a look. You'll also get links occasionally in these sort of wizards, which will take you to microsoftdocs.com to give you a bit more information if you're struggling to understand certain parts of it and what it's going to do. So these are the rules that we've got in place for low volume and high volume. So next we get to the decisions that we need to make for turning on our DLP policy, and here is where we need to be careful, because we don't want to be we want to ensure that our users are working in a compliant manner and not sharing sensitive information, but we don't want angry users at the same time. It's finding a balance between compliance and user experience, which is always a delicate balancing act. But when you're planning a DLP and rollout for Microsoft Teams, but with Microsoft 365 in general, always adopt a crawl, then walk, then run approach. And there are three steps to take this, basically. Always activate your DLP policy in test mode first without notifications. So that means that you are just seeing what would happen if there was a policy match, and you can dig into alerting and auditing and check any matches that would have occurred in this methodology. Then when you have gone through that to your satisfaction, when you've had that testing period, you can expand that out and do show policy tips while in test mode. That is going to give the users very visual prompts in their Microsoft 365 applications. In email, for example, they'll get a policy tip, a very sort of visual yellow prompt bar at the top, which will show them the policy tip. You've put a credit card in this email. Here's what you can do. Here's what you might want to do. Depending on how the policy is set up, they'll be given guidance by that policy tip. So this is a very powerful way of educating your users when you're rolling out DLP. Get them used to these policy tips, train them, and get them ready. Also involve pilot groups. Definitely involve pilot groups and proof of concept groups. in order to plan your DLP rollout for all M365 applications, not just Teams. Important, very, very important to have a diverse group of people for that pilot group as well. Try and include C-level executives, try and include, obviously IT teams are going to be involved in that. Try and include your friendly users, your evangelists, the frustrated IT professionals who have other areas of expertise, but they fancy themselves as a bit of an IT expert. They will be your friends. But by the same token, also involve the more challenging users in the organization as well, the ones who will ask the awkward questions, the ones who will, if you don't involve them and don't do the right things and prepare correctly, the ones who will be very, very change averse and say, well, this is preventing me from working. This worked way better the way it did before, which is the last thing any organization needs when trying to roll out new features of any kind, basically. So these are the options we have to test or turn on our policy. We can also just keep it off and turn it on later when you're ready. So what we'll do is we'll just change this one slightly. Let's imagine that we've been through our initial testing phase and we're ready to move on to test with notifications in policy mode. You can review your settings here just to make sure you're happy with everything. Yeah, I'm liking all that. That's good. We've made a couple of changes there. We've limited the teams that we're going to apply this to, and then we can go ahead and submit that. Just takes a few seconds, and or a few more seconds, and there we go. Our data loss prevention policy has now been updated. So we should see a slight change in how this appeared initially. It's changed from test without notifications to test with notifications. So that is data loss prevention. I did say at the start we'd probably quickly look at creating a policy. We've pretty much done that by editing it, but we'll just give you a very, very brief tour of what it looks like, but we'll not drain this content too much, mindful that we need to get onto retention as well. But when setting up a new DLP policy, we have a number of options here. You can work from the built-in templates and choose from regional templates based on these categories here: financial, medical, and health. You can filter it by country as well, so we can make choices here. There are a number of countries and states in here as well. So if we want to let's pick on Canada, for example, and see what we have for financial. We can choose a Canada financial data, medical and health. So we can go with that. I have not completed all of the required fields, so what have I missed there? What have I missed? That's flummoxed me. Choose the information you want to protect. Oh, I actually have to specifically pick one of the templates, doofus. Okay, so there we go. If you select the actual templates that you want, then it's going to show you what is going to be part of that. These are the subsets of information that's going to be included in that template. So now we can proceed. We can change the name here if we want. Important to get that name right at the beginning, because as you saw when we edited it, we can't change that later. We can go ahead here and select what we want to protect, as we saw when we edited. So we can toggle things on and off very, very easily here. By default, everything's enabled. Then if we trust what this policy is going to do at a basic level, we can just go with the default settings, the basic settings. If we want to go into advanced, we can make the selection here to go into the advanced DLP rules, and that is where we can drill down into these large forms contained when you edit the low volume and high volume of content detected, so you can be a bit more specific in the choices you make from an advanced point of view. But we'll go back here. We'll just set this up as a standard policy. And then you have some choices here. Detect when the content is shared with people inside or outside the organization. I will leave that one as it is. Excuse me. And then we've got some protection actions here that we need to make some choices on. When the content matches the policy conditions, show policy tips. So I alluded to this a bit earlier. Tips appear to users in their apps like Outlook, OneDrive, and SharePoint. Tips not so relevant to Teams. What you get in Teams is what I showed you in the in the slide earlier on where James tried to send something and it was just merely blocked. But the user tips within the other Microsoft 365 applications are a lot more customizable, shall we say. Detect the specific amount that is being shared at one time, because we're not doing the advanced options here. We're getting some choices to make on that here. Choosing what reports we want to send by email, and alerts if there is a DLP policy match. Do we want to restrict access or encrypt the content? So lots of choices there. Customize your override settings here. You can choose what actions you're going to take here. So by default, users are blocked from sending emails and Teams chats and channel messages that contain the type of content, but you can choose who has access to SharePoint and OneDrive files. You can also decide if you want to let people override. So make some choices here based on that as required. And there's a lot of controls here for third-party apps as well, if they are relevant. Then we've got our choices for turning on the policies. So always, to begin with, test it out first, or leave it turned off until you're ready to go into that test mode and submit it. Nice and simple, and we have our DLP policy set up, or we would have if I hadn't already got one with that template. And that's a good thing. It will prevent you from having duplicate policies. If it detects that you've already got one that applies to Canada Health Information Act, it's going to stop you from doing it. So I'll go ahead and I'll disregard that one. So that is DLP. That is the first of our two topics relating to compliance. So let's go back to my PowerPoint and we shall go back into our slideshow. And now we'll move on to talk finally. Well, we'll just quickly touch on some best practices for DLP. I've already really said this. These are your calls to action if you like, but start in test mode without policy tips. Monitor alerts and logs to check if policy is behaving as expected and make any required adjustments. Then number 2, move to test mode and notifications and policy tips. Teach your users how to use and understand policy tips. Policy tips, as I say, not as relevant in the context of Teams. And then enforce the policies when you're ready to turn them on. DLP policies are now live. Okay, so let's talk a bit now about retention. Retention, what is it? Within the context of Teams and Microsoft 365. So retention is an information governance principle which allows Microsoft 365 compliance administrators to ensure that data which is subject to internal policies and industry regulations is protected and retained for the required timescales, even if the user deletes this content. So how does retention work in Microsoft 365? We have a number of different principles here. We've got retention policies first and foremost, which are commonly used to protect at the site or mailbox level. So it's going to protect at that container level, shall we say, rather than item level, which is where we come to retention labels. Retention labels are commonly used to protect at the item level, such as the individual folders, documents, and emails. Retention policies may be set to retain or just as importantly, delete content. This is something that a lot of organizations don't quite realize, is that over retaining is as big a problem as over deleting. You have to be very, very mindful of your obligations as an organization in terms of retention, in terms of any internal policies that you may have and any industry regulations that you are bound by as an organization. So definitely have that in mind. One of the most important principles, though, of this is that retention will always win over deletion if there is a conflict between policies that you have set up for retention in Microsoft 365. So we've got a little screenshot here of an example of a common retention policy, the settings that you can put in place. And again, we'll get into a quick demo of these in a few moments. But when you're setting up a retention policy, you get some choices here. Do you want to retain this content? For how long? 7 years is in the example here, based on when it was created. You can also choose based on when it was modified. Do you want us to delete the content after this time? Yes or no? Or no, just delete the content that's older than a certain amount of a period of time. If you need some more options, there are some advanced retention settings that you can put into play as well, which you can leverage if you have specific licensing within Microsoft 365. So Microsoft 365 information governance retention policies can be applied to the following locations in a single or separate policy. We can apply it to Exchange, email, SharePoint sites, OneDrive accounts, Microsoft 365 groups, Skype for Business, and Exchange public folders. Teams may also be protected, most importantly, in the context of this, but it must, and this is crucial, it must be configured in its own separate retention policy. If you are wanting to protect content in Teams, it cannot exist in the same retention policy as other Microsoft 365 workloads, and that creates some other things to think about, as we will see when we get into the demo. So why should I use Microsoft 365 retention? I've already touched on some of these, but to comply with industry regulations and internal policies, to reduce risk in the event of litigation or a security breach, and to ensure that users are only working on content that is current and relevant. So how do we use retention with Microsoft Teams? With retention in Microsoft Teams, we are able to retain chat and channel messages. Now, chats are stored in a hidden folder of the mailbox of each user in the chat. Channel messages are stored in a hidden folder in the group mailbox for the team. Teams retention policies, as I've already alluded to, must be configured separately to retention policies for other Microsoft 365 workloads. You cannot avoid that, as we will see when we get into the demo. Which comes up right now. So let's get out of this slide deck and we will get back into our Microsoft 365 demo environment. We'll switch over to the tab for information governance here in the Compliance Center, specifically retention. Again, it's possible to access retention within Microsoft 365 from the more traditional security and compliance admin center at protection.office.com, but we will work as Microsoft want us to in this example from the newer compliance center at compliance.microsoft.com. And again, we'll just take it a step back. We go home and see what it looks like when you first log in. So we can then go to our solutions catalog from there, and we can go to information governance and open the solution or show it in the navigation if we want to pin it. And we're into information governance, which contains a number of different items in here. We've got labels in here, we've got label policies in here. Some of these labels may be sensitivity labels, some of these will be retention labels, and policies to apply those as well. There's an import feature in here as well, which is not relevant. That is, in the context of this talk, this is to import archived PST files into Microsoft 365. Archive similarly is to enable archive mailboxes, but the one we want to focus on here is retention policies specifically. So we've got some set up already here. We've got some examples here. What we'll do is we'll do this the other way this time. We'll start by creating a new one and then maybe look at editing one after that if we have some time left towards the end of the session. But let's go ahead and create a new retention policy here and see what that looks like. So I'm going to set one up, which is retention policy for Teams. I'll put in a quick description to retain chat and channel messages. And go next. So here we can decide the settings that we want to apply to retain or delete our content. We've got a nice little tip here. It shows here this applies to all content. You'll be able to choose the locations next. So nice little tips along the way if you need some extra guidance. What do we want to do? Do we want to retain the content? Yeah. So how long do we want to retain it? For this long or forever? I would strongly guide against forever. A lot of organizations do that, but you can get into all sorts of trouble with that, and unless there's a very, 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 very specific reason organizationally or compliance-wise, it's very unusual that I would ever recommend doing that. This is going to be based on, as I've said, internal policies and industry regulations. The sweet spot is often 7 years, but you can change that down to whatever you need to and change it to days and months as well. You can choose to retain the content that your retention policy is going to apply to based on when that content was created or when it was last modified. So then when you made these decisions on retaining it, you can make some choices here about what you want to happen after the content has reached the end of that retention period. Do you want us to delete that content after this time? Yes or no? So we can make some choices there. Typically, I would. Again, this will depend on your policies as an organization, and you will need to have stakeholder conversations about what this looks like for you as an organization. Very, very important to involve the correct people on that journey, as it was with DLP. Get the people involved who can, from an organizational level, comment on this, have discussions about this. Compliance is not an IT problem. Well, not solely an IT problem. IT can advise, can guide on the technical abilities and aspects of it, but from a business point of view, the business stakeholders are crucial to this. If you have compliance people in your organization, they may need to be involved. If you have lawyers that you engage or retain, they need to be involved potentially as well. Don't let them shrink from it. This is challenging for IT administrators. Often people tend to say, oh, I don't have time to think about this, but this is important. Try and find ways to get them engaged on this and emphasize its importance. Excuse me. So we've made the choice here at the top of our retention policy here. Yes, we want to retain it. We could also in this policy say, no, we want a policy here that's just going to specifically delete content that is older than a certain period of time. So as I alluded to at the start of this presentation, hugely important not to over-retain content as well for compliance reasons in many situations. So here we could have a policy where we would delete content that is older than a certain amount of years based on when it was created or when it was modified. But for this example, we'll do the retain for 7 years. There are some more advanced retention settings here. There's not much here that you can choose between in terms of the drop down. You can choose between detect content that contains specific words or phrases. Well, when I say there's not too much choice, there's a lot of powerful stuff in here, which you will see on the next screen if we go advanced. So you can choose specific words and phrases or contain sensitive info. If we pick the sensitive info, for example, and go to the next screen, we get into that same dialogue that we saw in our DLP policy, where we can match our retention policy against these standards here, these sensitive information types that are built in based on regional and sectoral, for want of a better word, choices. But for the purposes of this, we'll not go for advanced. We'll just go for a standard retention policy and go next. So here on the next screen, we need to choose our locations. We have two options here. We can apply the policy only to content and exchange, email, public folders, or 365 groups, or OneDrive and SharePoint documents. So if we select that one, it's just going to take the other choices away. If we want to be more specific, we can choose what we want to protect with our retention policy. And again, we've got very granular choices of how we can drill down into these Microsoft 365 workloads and what we want to include and exclude. Now, we want to look at Teams, chat, and channel messages. And you will hopefully recall that I mentioned that Teams retention policies must exist in retention policies all by themselves, separate to these other workloads that are available in retention policies. And you don't get a choice in that matter, as you will see when I toggle this on and I toggle this on. The ones above, they went off. And I have just accidentally clicked on the back button. I apologize for that. Let's just get back to where we were. No, we don't want to do a label. I want to come out of that. Retention, new retention policy. We'll just call it, just to get back to where we were, we'll call it test 2. And where were we? We were at locations and we toggled on our Teams chat and channel messages. So there we go. This shows that we must have Teams chat and channel messages within their own policies. Now, this leads to a very important consideration in that Teams interacts very, very strongly with a number of different workloads within Microsoft 365. If you have one-to-one chats in Microsoft Teams, then those chats are going to be stored in the individual mailboxes of that individual user who is sending the chat. If you have group chats within Microsoft Teams, then those chats are going to be stored in the Office 365 group that alludes to. So If you want full Teams retention, you have to consider other retention policies as well. So it's not enough to have these switched on. What you will need in order to ensure that you can get that content back is Exchange email for those one-to-one chats. You will need Office 365 groups for those group chats. You'll also need SharePoint sites in another policy as well to include the document content that is within those teams that you want to apply retention to. So we'll go ahead and create those. We get some settings here to review before we create our policy, and importantly you get this very visual cue here just to let you know that it will take up to a day to apply the retention policy to the locations you chose. That is true of a number of features within Microsoft Security and Compliance Portal features. You have to be very, very mindful when you're setting up anything like this to just be aware that some things take time. So don't get worried if things don't happen immediately. That can throw some people off, but be very aware that you have to be very, very patient for things like this at times. If you want to create this, we can go ahead and create this now, or we can save it for later, but we'll go ahead and create this policy. And there we have our policy test 2. You can tell I am very, very imaginative with my test naming. I don't put too much thought into it as a rule, but there we go. It proves the point. That retention policy is there now. That will kick into place within 24 hours, and it's good to go. And content which is targeted by the locations we've applied to will be retained and can be discovered even after it's been deleted by the user. The user may think they've deleted it, but it is protected. It is retained, which is what we want. We can go back in and edit. As I say, if we click on it here, we can quickly get a view of what the retention policy is doing, and take some additional actions. We can edit the policy, delete the policy. What you can do, be very careful of this one as well, is you can turn on preservation lock as well. So if we I can't actually do that on Teams. Maybe you can't do that on Teams. I didn't particularly realize that, but let's just see if we can do that on a You can obviously not edit. That is something I didn't necessarily realize. I've potentially learned something there. You obviously must have to set up a preservation lock when you're setting up a retention policy from scratch. But basically that means if you turn preservation lock on for a retention policy, then it's there forever. Even Microsoft probably can't or won't help you to get rid of it, and stop applying the settings that it's got in place. So be very, very careful of preservation lock. So that is retention policies. Now, both retention policies and DLP also relate to sensitive information types, just finally, and we've not looked at those specifically. We've seen them in action within these workloads in Microsoft 365, but where do they actually live? And they live in the Security and Compliance Center at protection.office.com. So we'll just take a look at that and see what that looks like. And where does that live again? Is it under classification? Yes, it is. Well remembered. So under classification and sensitive information types, this is where you can see the full list. And if you want to create any customized ones, if you wish to. So here we go. We've got this very, very exhaustive list of these sensitive information types. We can click on them and see what settings are aligned to them. And importantly, you can't delete or edit any of the built-in ones, only the customizable ones. So if you wanted to go ahead and create a custom one, you just hit this create button here, and we can type in a name, custom sensitive information type. You've got to give it a description, so we'll just call it sensitive information type, just for the sake of it. Requirements for matching, you've got to add a matching element, which is the sensitive info that this type will look for. We've not got any elements set at the moment, so we want to go ahead and add an element. So what do we want to do here? We want to add And here we can choose between keywords, regular expressions, or the dictionary large keywords that I mentioned in the slide deck earlier on. If you want to put in keywords, you can put in whatever you need to match against with commas in between the values that you want to include. Just for argument's sake, I'll just put in here just teams and supporting elements. You can add supporting elements in them which contain, again, regular expressions, keyword lists, or dictionary keywords. You can set the confidence level that relates to it and the character proximity. So meaning that when the first pattern element is matched, any supporting elements will match only when found inside this proximity to the first pattern element. As you can probably tell from the way I'm describing this, I've not done a great deal with customized sensitive information types myself. I know very little about regular expressions. Much as Chris said in his session, it's possibly something I should look to blog about and get a bit more conversant with, shall we say. But there we go. It's easy enough to create a sensitive information type, but that was a very, very uneloquent way that I did so, to be honest. So here we go. It tells you that it's created. It's recommended to test it before you use it. Do you want to test your created sensitivity type? Sensitive type? We'll just say no on this occasion. And you can. I've done such a poor job on that it hasn't even got a name. So, but it gives you an idea of the process you need to look into if you need to look into that for your compliance journey. So we shall return to our slide deck to close things off and talk about some best practices for retention. We've already alluded to these somewhat, and just to recap though, very important to involve the correct business stakeholders in your retention policy deployment plan. Understanding how these policies need to be configured is a business decision. IT teams can advise on the required technologies, but not on what content needs to be retained or deleted and the periods of time involved. Get to know the service dependencies and the efforts and the effects of the various retention policies within Microsoft 365. For example, if a user mailbox is deleted, but that user had Teams chats which were subject to a Teams retention policy, the user mailbox will be retained as an inactive mailbox. And remember that Teams retention policies may not be set in the same retention policy if that policy is applied to other Microsoft 365 workloads, as the screenshot shows here. You can't fall foul of that though, because it simply won't let you do it. Okay, and this lovely slide here, I'm going to be very honest, I pinched this from Patrick earlier because I think it's awesome. So thank you, Patrick, for that.